What's up, Tailgaters? You're in the booth with Tailgate Nate today. Welcome to my channel and welcome to my Week 8 takeaways video. It was another busy week in the college football landscape, and today I'm just going to be going through the 5 biggest things that I took away from this past weekend of college football action. We got a lot to dive on into and talk about and just break down what happened this past week. But hey, before I do that, just thank you for helping support me in any way that you already do. And please continue to support me in really any way you can if you would like to, if you just found this channel, if you've watched a lot of my content but haven't really interacted with it in any way. Well, now's your chance. You can interact with me anyway here on YouTube, and it all helps to support what I do here on this platform. Of course, the biggest way is subscribing and ringing the bell so you know when I upload. You especially got to do that if you're as big of a college football nerd as I am, and thank you so much for taking time out of, I'm sure, your busy day to watch this video. But you can also like, comment, and share. And hey, go give me a follow on Twitter or X at TailgateNate29. Going to try to be posting a little bit more about some of the other field work and stuff I do. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I will waste no more of your time. Let's dive on in and talking about Week 8 of the college football season. It was a busy slate, some really close games, some scares, and teams ended up holding on, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in my top 25 video. That also is going to come out today. I anticipate both of these videos going live at about the same time, if not directly right at the same time, so feel free to go watch my top 25 after you watch this video. Or hey, maybe you've already watched my top 25 and you're coming over to this one. But I do want to start talking a little bit about the college football playoff. We are starting to get into November. Playoff conversation is going to start heating up even more than it is already being talked about right now. And my big takeaway here is, with all the chaos that we continue to see out of the Big 12, with the chaos that we continue to see out of the SEC, which we will talk about later here in this video, guys, I think we could see a 3-loss team in the college football playoff field. This is absolutely a season where there's just been a lot of chaos that has gone on, and a 3-loss team making the college football playoff. I know the top 14 teams in the rankings right now are teams that only have 1 loss, and obviously only 12 make the college football playoff. So you think, okay, why do you think you're going to see a 3-loss team? I don't think Alabama is out of the college football playoff race, and they got some tough games coming up. They could definitely have a 3rd loss on there, and I think if a lot of chaos happens, they could still see themselves there in that field. We know we're going to see multiple 2-loss teams in this college football playoff field. It is inevitably going to happen, but a 3-loss team, I absolutely think that, yeah, it could potentially happen. I mean, and where would it likely come from, in my opinion? Well, I think it's likely going to come from the SEC if we do have one, because Georgia, they still got to play Ole Miss and Tennessee back-to-back weeks. They have some really good wins, especially this past one over Texas. That, again, we'll talk about in just a little bit. Georgia's also got a win over the Clemson Tigers, who, as it currently stands according to the AP poll, are a top 10 team. So you just go ahead and you take a look at a lot of the things around here. If there is going to be a 3-loss team, I mean, maybe it comes from the Big Ten Conference, but I don't see Oregon, Penn State, or Ohio State coming away with 3 losses once the season is all said and done. I could very well see a couple teams in the SEC doing it. LSU, A&M, Alabama, maybe even Tennessee or Georgia. I could definitely see some of those teams winding up with at least, winding up with 3 losses. Now, do I consider this a likelihood? Much like I talked about with Boise State sort of making a top 4 spot, no. I don't think it's likely we see a 3-loss team in the playoff field, but with all the chaos and everything that we continue to see this year, I had to put it as one of my takeaways, because coming into this year, I thought, if you get 3 losses, you're probably not making the college football playoff. I could absolutely see a 3-loss team making the college football playoff this year, but not really going to talk much more about that one. And I'm not going to linger on this one for too much, because I've kind of already hammered this point home in some of my other takeaways videos. But okay, it was a fun little conversation back then to say, okay, you know, you might want to start watching out for these teams. No, this is not a drill. You got to take Army, you got to take Navy, and you absolutely must take Indiana seriously. All 3 of these teams are legitimate college football playoff contenders, especially that team you see there in the middle. How about the Indiana Hoosiers? Now, I know their strength of schedule is not great right now. I know they don't have any top 25 wins under their belt, but they just played a team that a lot of people would consider their toughest test so far in the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I know they got some things offensively that didn't quite go their way, but Indiana beating their toughest test so far by 49 points. I mean, come on, that says something. That's not a Nebraska team. That's bad, guys. They got Dylan Raiola. He's a really, really good quarterback. They got some other tried and true weapons there, especially defensively. That was the first top 35 defense that Indiana faced. My goodness, did that team absolutely put on a show. Now, Rourke is hurt right now. He's probably not going to play in that game against UW, and we hope that he can get healthy quickly because, again, Indiana still has got some pretty big games coming up on their schedule. Obviously, Washington this week. You still got Michigan on the schedule. You got to go on the road to play Michigan State, who just handled Iowa. And then, of course, the big one against Ohio State in Columbus, second to last week of the season, is still there on that schedule. But do not sleep on the Indiana Hoosiers. If the season were to end today, right now, I would put this team in the college football playoff. I'm not saying that's what the committee would do, but me personally, I would have Indiana in the college football playoff if the season were to end today. But I know a lot of people are going to continue to talk about Boise State, and for very good reason. They probably have the best player in the country in Ashton Jeanty, and if they win out, they're probably going to end up getting that group of 5 spot. But let me take a second to just tell you what can happen with Army and Navy. Those two teams could play in the conference championship game. And then if something happens to Boise State where they lose a game or they don't win the Mountain West Conference, that Boise State's got a really big one coming up against UNLV this week. And these two teams play in the conference championship game. They both have to play Notre Dame, a team that likely is going to be very, very highly regarded by the College Football Playoff Committee, especially if they win out. I know they have that loss to the Northern Illinois Huskies, but wins over both Army and Navy. You're probably going to have to beat some other pretty solid teams in there. They already have a win over Georgia Tech. They have a win over Texas A&M, which is in the top 15. But here's the thing, right? They both have to play Notre Dame. They can both make the American Athletic Championship game. The winner of that can be announced for the college football playoff, and then they have to play the Army-Navy game the very next week. Isn't that just absolutely wild and crazy? I mean, come on. We love college football, but for the first time, now not saying I hadn't seen highlights and watched glimpses, but for the first time this week, I actually sat down and I watched both Army and Navy play a full 60-minute game of football, and my goodness, was I impressed, especially by Army. Bryson Daly has got that dog in him, and Navy just looks like a complete team as well. All three of these teams are legitimate college football playoff contenders. No, this is not a drill. This is the real world. You are living in a world where Indiana football is really, really good, and Army and Navy are both exceptionally good football teams in their own right as well. Let's start talking about some of the games that happened this past week, and I do want to dive on in to the world of the ACC. A lot of people are going to look and say, okay, it's Miami, it's Clemson. There really is no one else within the ACC. Well, I would also not count out SMU, and I know I'm highlighting the SMU Mustangs here, but I also would not count out a couple other teams. I wouldn't count out Pitt, even though Pitt has not really played anybody super substantial this year, and you could definitely argue that SMU hasn't either, but SMU went on the road and picked up a win against the Louisville Cardinals, who are ranked. They got a win over a TCU team who's pretty solid, and their only loss, granted it was a home loss, but to the BYU Cougars, and BYU, in some people's eyes, is a top 10 team right now. At the very least, they're a top 15 team, and they're one of the front runners within the Big 12 Conference. Not a bad loss at all. This team has finally found their offensive rhythm, and SMU, you look here coming up, they do not have to play Miami. They do not have to play Clemson on that schedule. Now, Miami and Clemson don't have to play each other either. SMU does have to play Pitt. They still have to play Duke. They don't have to play Syracuse. But guys, I think the ACC is a little bit more wide open than some people give it credit for, because I think Duke, Syracuse, and maybe Virginia Tech, they're both sitting with 2-1 conference records. I think if enough happens, they both could still be alive. But SMU, Pitt, Miami, and Clemson are still all undefeated in conference play. Now, Clemson has the least amount of conference games left to go. They got Louisville, Virginia Tech, and Pitt left on that conference schedule. That's a road game against Pitt. Watch out, which is why, again, I just said that I think Pitt can create some chaos here. Pitt has SMU. They have Clemson on that schedule. Big one coming up against Syracuse this week, though. But Pitt is sitting at 6-0 and undefeated right now. So a lot of people are saying Miami and Clemson are on a collision course in the ACC. And while I would agree with that, and I may have had that takeaway in a previous video, I don't remember if I did, but I wouldn't be surprised if I did either. So I might be going back on my word here. But I mean, yeah, Miami and Clemson, I think by far and away are the two best teams within the ACC right now. but the SMU Mustangs shouldn't be counted out. The Pittsburgh Panthers, again, I know I said I'm highlighting the SMU Mustangs here, but the Pittsburgh Panthers should not be counted out of the ACC race either. Both SMU and Pitt, I think, are legit teams. I think SMU a little bit more so than Pitt, but that is my own personal opinion as it currently stands. Miami and Clemson, watch out. Again, you see who has to play what. Clemson has still got Pitt left on that schedule. Miami, they don't really have anybody substantial. So honestly, Miami, look, I know they've looked shaky the past couple weeks. I know they've escaped with a couple games that they maybe should have lost in some other universes and some other worlds, and they still got some tough ones coming up. They still got to play Duke, still got to play on the road against Georgia Tech and on the road against Miami to close out this season. This is going to be a really interesting ACC race. Again, don't count out some of these other teams that sit towards the top of the conference. It's not just a Miami and Clemson race, at least in my opinion. Let's move on over to the Big 12 here. Not a whole lot interesting in the Big 10, so we don't really have to dive on into that one, but let's talk about the Big 12. Who would have thunk, at the beginning of the year that we would be sitting here talking about Iowa State and BYU controlling their own destinies within the Big 12 Conference? Now, it was not pretty for either of these two teams this past weekend. BYU on Friday, again, really, really tough game against Oklahoma State. Couldn't really defend Ollie Gordon as well as some of the other teams had, and they just, I don't think, played their best brand of football, but here's what good teams do. They find a way to get the win, and that's exactly what BYU did. Now, that is also exactly what Iowa State did against UCF as well. UCF was beating them and battering them, and Iowa State had to go down the field. Final minute, they end up getting the touchdown there to win that game. By the way, both teams finished with wins of the exact same score, 38-35, and in very similar fashion there as well. But you take a look at the Big 12 standings, BYU and Iowa State sit as the only undefeated teams in conference play and the only undefeated teams left in the conference. And the beauty of it is they don't have to play each other. BYU and Iowa State do not play each other, at least in the regular season. They could meet up in the Big 12 championship game, and obviously if both of them meet undefeated, well, they're both going to get college football playoff spots anyway, but they would be playing for that first round bye. Now, Iowa State still has a road game against Utah coming up. They still have a home game against Kansas State. Don't discount Cincinnati or Texas Tech. Those will be some interesting games for the Cyclones. BYU, and they got to go on the road and play UCF this week. We know what UCF just did. They went toe-to-toe with these Cyclones. Another road game against Utah. That's a rivalry game, and then a road game against Arizona State still coming up as well. So each of these teams still have their tricky games. I would argue Iowa State's probably got the tougher road because they do have to play the Kansas State Wildcats, a team that BYU has already played and beat. Kansas State is still in the thick of things here as well, but with some fairly simple roads down the stretch, all Iowa State and BYU have got to do is take care of business, and we could see both of these teams in the college football playoff. Again, who would have thought we'd be talking about Iowa State and BYU atop of the Big 12 Conference at this point in the season, but you can't discount either of these teams, even though that you could argue maybe these teams are not going to fare that well in the college football playoff. I might beg to differ a little bit. I think these are two very legit teams here, BYU and Iowa State, guys, fighting atop the Big 12, and if they all take care of business, I should say if they both take care of business, we'll be on a collision course in the Big 12 championship game. Again, we know this is the Big 12. Chaos can absolutely happen, but these are the two front runners right now. Yeah, Iowa State and BYU. I said it last week, and I'm going to double down on my takeaway from this past week. The SEC is going to be absolutely wild. You take a look, and Georgia went on the road and beat the Texas Longhorns. Georgia had not looked great. Carson Beck even still looked shaky in that game, and he now has, I think, 7 or 8 interceptions in his last 4 games when he had 7 all of last season. The Dogs just didn't look like themselves offensively in that they couldn't really run the football all that well. The defense was not as physically tough as we had seen some Georgia defenses in years prior when they were winning national championships. Well, Georgia got back to doing all of that. The defense, it was super physical. It was getting after this Texas offensive front that had been stout all season. Try 7 sacks and 10 tackles for loss. My goodness. And you take a look at that Georgia rush game. Oh, yeah, it did pretty well. Averaged 7.6 yards per carry. Texas has got some issues. Quinn Ewers didn't play well in that game, but I think more importantly, I don't think Texas played absolutely awful. Yeah, they did not play their best football, but Georgia played outstanding. That defense was next level. They got back to playing Georgia football. They ran the football really, really well. Or sorry, that was the Georgia receiving number there, 7.6 yards per reception. I mean, still 3.9 yards per carry is not Georgia football, but it was better than what they were getting uh, before. 87 yards and 3 touchdowns on 19 carries out of Trevor Etienne, average 4.6 yards per carry. That is what you need to see. So I'll correct my mistake earlier there. I apologize profusely. Again, Carson Beck did not have his best day. Threw 3 picks there in that game, and he's got to play better. But if that dog defense plays like that, I mean, my goodness, Georgia's going to be a very hard team to beat. And again, my takeaway, Georgia is back. And they seem to figure out a lot of their issues, especially defensively in that game. Yeah, you want to see him try to run the football maybe a little bit better, but that defense especially was the big concern. They got that all figured out for the moment, it seems. Bama, though, they are not back. Again, really, it was going to be a tough game for them to win on the road against Tennessee, but the get-back game for the Volunteers, even though the offense still did not look absolutely outstanding. Tennessee did a much better job than Alabama there in that game. They were able to hold their own. Bama had the lead for the most part there in that first half, and honestly, it seemed like Bama should be up by a lot more on that scoreboard, but Tennessee kept fighting. Nico Iamaleava didn't have his greatest game, still has yet to throw for over 200 yards in SEC play, but Dylan Sampson, have yourself a game. This Tennessee defense, have yourself a game. 3 sacks and 9 tackles for loss there in that one. Only allowed Alabama to get 314 yards, and we know Alabama, one of the most explosive offenses in the country. But the thing that Coach Kalen DeBoer needs to harp on this Bama team about is all the self-inflicted mistakes, all the penalties that Alabama keeps having this year. They had 15 penalties in this game. I'm not saying Tennessee was perfect either. They had 11 penalties here in this game, but 15 is a ridiculous number. I still think Tennessee has got some things to figure out, and the secondary definitely was shown that, like, hey, it's definitely got some issues, did force 2 picks, but it's still got some things to work out. Bama's got a lot to figure out, and they've still got a lot of tough games left. I believe they still have LSU. They got Missouri this week. The Iron Bowl is never an easy game, even though Auburn is not the greatest team this year. This is going to be an absolutely wild race to the finish within the SEC. But guys, how about this? Texas A&M and LSU right now are atop the conference. Hey, guess what? That game is going to be played this week, and that one is going to be really, really fun. But, I mean, you could really look at a whole ton of these teams. A&M, LSU, Georgia, Tennessee, even Missouri and Texas, they still are all sitting with either undefeated or 1-loss conference records. You have right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams in the SEC that have a 6-1 record. And how about this? Vanderbilt. Yeah, if Vanderbilt can win out and cause some more chaos, maybe they can get to Atlanta. Now, I don't think that is going to happen. Sorry, Vandy. I think that's a really good story this year, and I do think that football team is still really good. I just don't think they stack up to a lot of the other teams here in SEC play, but that's also what we thought when they went ahead and beat Bama. That's going to do it for my Week 8 takeaways, guys. This is going to be an absolutely wild and crazy finish. We got the last week of October football coming up here. Some really good games on the slate. We'll get you out to my top 25 here later on, if not uploaded at the exact same time. And then tomorrow, I got a couple weekday preview predictions to put out for you guys. Remember to play hard but tailgate harder. Go catch my top 25. See y'all in the next one. Goodbye.